Thank you for joining us at Community on Demand. Today's message is presented by Dan Greer. Dan holds a doctorate from Grace School of Theology and is the senior pastor here at Community Church. This message was recorded during a live Sunday morning service at Community. Let's listen in as Dan begins.
Hey, I read an article this week that came out this year by the Lowell Psychiatric Association, and what they were doing is they were writing about behavioral disorders. Well, this is interesting. So the article starts out like this. Let me read this. It says, behavioral disorders are classified as patterns of behavior that are disruptive and harmful to you and those around you. These disorders are typically diagnosed and treated in early childhood, but if left untreated, they can affect your adult life, making it difficult for you to maintain healthy relationships, regular employment, and other functions of typical adult life. So I read some other articles, and this one too, and this particular article and several other psychiatric journals list 5 common behavioral disorders. I thought I'd share these things with you this morning. So the very first one that they list, at the top of the list, is called conduct disorder, CD. And here's how they define it. These folks struggle with antisocial behavior. They struggle with following rules and showing empathy toward those around them. Okay. Here's the second one. Oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. Now this behavioral disorder is questioning authority, showing and not showing empathy. They struggle. Let me get this, okay? They struggle in questioning authority, acting out defiance, and throwing tantrums. Here's another one. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It used to be called hyperactivity on one hand, and then it used to be called attention deficit on the other hand, and now they've put them together, and it is ADHD. ADHD. The inability to pay attention, impulsivity, mood swings, low frustration level, trouble coping with stress. And number 4, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. We've heard that one. Constant worry, severe doubt, dire uncertainty, fear of losing control, the need to have things orderly or symmetrical. And then number 5 is simply behavioral addiction, BA. And this one, BA, it says addiction occurs when your brain associates pleasure and activities and its reward mechanism when engaging in an activity. It associates the two and then it kicks off this pleasure hormone, I guess. And it says there are many behaviors. Now, this is where I'm going to get in trouble, okay? I can already tell. I can feel the glares. Are you ready? There are many behaviors that you can become addicted to, including gambling, okay, sex, internet shopping, video games, plastic surgery, binge eating, or risky behavior. Now, in another article that came out this last year, May 22nd, 2024, the Pew Charitable Trust organization reports that behavioral needs are largely unmet in the United States. He goes on to say, recent data shows that Americans across different racial, ethnic and demographic groups are disproportionately grappling with mental illness and behavioral health needs and have lower levels of access to culturally competent care and resources. Now, these are articles that have come out just recently, this last year and this year, they've come out. Now, you might ask, well, Pastor Dan, have you ever struggled with a behavior disorder? Quit laughing at me. Because the answer is yes. Yes, of course. I called it AMS. Are you ready for this? Acute misbehavior syndrome. You hadn't heard of that one? Yeah. Well, fortunately, my parents discovered the cure early in my childhood. They applied the Board of Education and the belt of truth to my seat of my misbehavior, and it seemed to work, or at least curb the misbehavior some. That was the treatment for the disorder. We don't do that anymore, do we? You know, unfortunately, we live at a time when people tend to seek secular and humanistic solutions, counselors, psychologists, and therapists who do not see the value, now get this, the value of incorporating scriptural application in the treatment of behavioral disorders. That's just a thing of the past. And the result is an epidemic in behavior disorder across our country. Folks, this is crazy running around and burning up dealerships and cars and stuff like that. That's not natural behavior. That's a behavioral disorder. So we have an epidemic out there. When the Apostle Paul visited the churches there in Titus, or in the book of Titus, he was visiting the churches there on the island of Crete for about 3 weeks. And as he did that, he recognized that this same epidemic of behavior disorders was rampant across the whole island. I mean, he even mentions that. One of their philosophers attested to that. And what he found is that a lot of the behavioral disorders that were in the culture of that area were seeping into the church. And that's what the whole book of Titus is written about, is dealing with some of these behavior issues. And some of the orders he lists, let me go back. We've listed this a couple of times, some of the things that he was dealing with, but just to refresh our memory, let me go back and just throw out a short list of some of the behavioral disorders that Paul was dealing with inside the churches there at Crete. Here they are: insubordination, lying, deception, subversion, denying, and disobedience. Now, the book of Titus was written to correct those issues. So I call this, of course, I've titled this whole series God's Handbook on Leadership, because it takes a little bit of leadership to help develop some of the guidelines and some of the solutions to these behavioral issues among believers. And so I've called this message today, Guidelines in Grace. Because when we think about grace, we think about, you just do anything you want to do. There's no law. There's no restriction, but that's not true. There's guidelines in grace, and Paul sets forth those guidelines where we're going to come up to chapter 2 and verse number 15 today and go all the way across to chapter 3 and verse 2. And what we'll find there are some guidelines in grace to help curb those behavioral issues that people are struggling with in our culture and in our communities and in our churches. And so I want to start out with 3 guidelines that we find there in chapter 2, verse 15. And those 3 guidelines, I would call them repeat, restore, rebuke. Let me say them again. Repeat, restore, rebuke. I've got them in your outline there, but let's kind of go through them and just talk about them. The very first thing that we find there is that Paul teaches Titus to teach the people to repeat some principles. He says 3 words here: speak these things. Now, this is actually a repetition of something that he said earlier. And when you jump into chapter 2, we're down to verse 15 here, but if you go all the way back up to verse 1, he says it earlier. He says, speak these things which are proper for sound doctrine. So sandwiched between verse 1 and chapter 2 are the rules, are the roles and the responsibilities of leadership in the church. And we spent 2 full weeks on this in the series here. And so what he's doing is he's giving the roles and responsibilities for older men, older women, young women, servants, and church leadership. Now hold that thought for just a minute, because those are these things that he's talking about, that he sandwiched in here. Do you see this word? Both times he says the word speak. Now, and he uses this word a few times here. We're going to talk about this word because he uses it over and over again. This word speak is laleo. It means to engage in conversation, ranging from small talk to scholarly literature. These things are the principles, the rules, and responsibilities in Titus chapter 1 and chapter 2. So let's we reviewed some of the behavioral issues. Now let's go and review some of these things that he's saying for us to speak. If we go back and kind of classify them. So as we review these things, Titus is speaking about principles of holiness, sobriety, reverence, patience, discretion, love, obedience, I've already said chastity, integrity, and respect toward leaders. And so when you look and read that whole sentence there, here's what he says. He says, speak these things which are proper for sound doctrine. He's saying these things are proper for sound doctrine. You're speaking doctrine. So Paul calls this kind of conversation sound doctrine. So when folks are speaking and talking these things, they tend to move away from negative talk, criticism, and condemnation and the accompanying behavior. So what he's telling us here in the beginning, one of the guidelines is that we need to be speaking these things over and over and over again, conversationally, doctrinally, teaching. That's what in the building next to us, that's what they're doing. They're teaching these things. They're teaching things about integrity and holiness and discretion and love and all of those things. So that's guideline number 1. We got to do it over and over and over and over again. We're instilling the principles of grace into our kids, to ourselves, and those listening. The second guideline is there in verse 15 is to restore these people. It's interesting that the Apostle Paul uses this word exhort. And by the way, it's just one word. Do you see that? Restoring the people? One word, resort. Resort. I'm thinking about Hawaii again. Come on, man. Come on. Exhort. He uses this word 4 times in Titus. And so far in these 2 chapters here, that's where it is. But in chapter 2, he uses the word exhort 3 out of the 4 times. And he's telling, so who exactly do we need to exhort? We need to exhort, he says, young men, servants, and contradictors. Now let's look at this word exhort. This is really an exciting word. It's parakaleo. Does that sound familiar to you? Parakaleo. You've heard that before. Parakletes is the nickname that Jesus gave to the Holy Spirit in John chapter 10. He said, I'm going to send to you the Parakletes, the helper. And so this word means basically someone to personally come alongside someone to help and encourage them by instilling courage, to urge, implore, entreat, encourage. Earlier, Paul mentioned that the entire population of Crete had a horrible reputation of habitual, unrelenting, negative, bad behavior. Remember that? He said, everybody in the world knows it. Their prophets talk about it. These folks really struggle with behavior. And again, I said this before, the negativity was seeping into the churches. And so what he's doing here, he's saying, hey, look, it's going to come into the church. So you that are mature, come alongside folks who are struggling with sinful behavior to encourage them, urge them, implore them to stop the sinful behavior. And then reconcile and restore that person to God and to other believers. So the guidelines are like, repeat the principles, restore the people, and then he comes to a tough one here, rebuke the persistent. And it says in the latter part of the verse there, and rebuke with all authority, let no man despise you. Now, this is the third time that Paul circles back around to this issue of rebuking those who are stubborn and persistent in their negative behavior. And he's talking about church discipline here. Now, the word rebuke, we're doing kind of a word study right now. So the word rebuke is in linko. It means to bring to light, bring a person to the point of recognizing his or her wrongdoing, convict, convince, correct. We live in the Laodicean age. Some of you may not know what that is, but when you go to the book of Revelation and look in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, you'll see seven different churches that the whole book of Revelation is written to. I believe that they were written to 7 literal churches, but I also believe they were written to 7 church ages down through the last 2,000 years, and I believe that they're written to 7 different types of churches today. And the biggest type of the church today is the Laodicean church. The Laodicean church is the church that's healthy and wealthy and wise. The church that really doesn't need anything. The church that is just everything is going really good and the pretty surface. And the Lord looks at that church and he says, you don't get it. You're naked and you're blind and you're poor and you're wretched and you don't get it. You don't see it. And then he comes up with this verse here. And he's saying it to the church and the church members of the Laodicean church age. That would be our age right now before the rapture of the church, before the return of the Lord. And here's what he says to that church. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Therefore be zealous and repent. That's to us. That's to our church age. Paul's whole game plan in the book of Titus was to help folks in these families, in these churches, in these communities to overcome negative behavior through repetition, restoration, rebuke if necessary, so that God's people, as 2 Chronicles would say, so that God's people would be repentant of misbehavior. That you would see it and be repentant of it. So obviously, sinful, negative behavior was a problem in the island of Crete, and I'm here to say today that it's a problem in our country today. I mean, look around in our community. It even sometimes, because of our culture and because of our secular mentality and our humanism that we just can't help get away from, what happens is some of it begins seeping into the church and we fall victim to it. So it happens. So how do we implement these guidelines? How do we as a whole, as a body, how do we repeat, restore, and gently rebuke if necessary? How do we do that? How do we teach? How do we do it with ourselves? How do we do it with our kids? We want our kids to grow up in the nurture and that image of the Lord. So how do we do that? So Paul continues this whole segment right here with by reminding us of some things. And if we remember these things, it helps us to step within these guidelines. So let's continue to read the verse and see what he wants to remind us of so that we can be all in on repeating, restoring, and rebuking if necessary. Number one, we're to be reminded to be submissive. remind them to be subject to rulers and authority. Now, this is an extraordinary statement. I don't know if you understand that or not. You say, why is it such an extraordinary statement? It's because Paul is reminding his readers, now that would be us right now, to be submissive. The word ruler is arche, and the word authorities is exousias, and it implicates government rulers and authorities. Let me say that again. Arche, exousias, is implicating government rulers and authority. Now that kind of works against us a little bit, doesn't it? Yeah. Especially when you see all the corruption and stuff that's going on in government today. So you say, well, I get that, Dan. Are you sure that's what it means? Well, let me show you why I think it's extraordinary, okay? And we'll go back and look at this and verify this is exactly what he's saying in just a moment. But let me give you one little fact. Paul wrote the book of Titus, the letter to Titus, in around 63 AD, according to most scholars out there. Now, when you go and look at your history books, excuse me, I've got a cough. Got to drink some water. Give me a break. When you go back and look at your history book to see who was the ruler of the Roman Empire during that time, you will discover something a little bit disturbing. Because the guy by the name of Nero reigned from 54 to 68. Paul writes this in about 64. So who was ruling Rome when Paul was writing Titus and when Paul was writing Romans? It was Nero. It was Nero who tortured Christians for fun. It was Nero who had set Christians afire and put them in his garden. It was Nero who had allegedly burned Rome. It was Nero, crazy Nero, that was on the throne when Paul wrote, remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities. Now that's kind of rough, isn't it? Let me go to Romans chapter 3, where he kind of gives a commentary on this right here. He says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. He's specific now. For there's no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists the ordinance of God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to the good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is, now watch this, God's minister to you for good. In other words, God allows the rulers to get in place when they do. So what he's teaching us here is, generally speaking, in our governmental authorities, is that we need to be subjective. We need to be respectful there. You know, when you're reading Matthew chapter 8, there's a military officer that came along, and he came up to Jesus, and he said to Jesus, he said, Lord, teacher, rabbi, I've got a servant that's really sick, and I'm asking you if you'll heal him. And Jesus said, sure, let's go. And the military officer said, no. I am a man of authority. I have people above me. I have people below me. I understand authority. I accept authority. And I know that you have authority. Whatever you say will happen. You don't have to come, just speak the word. He recognized Christ as the authority of the universe. At the same time, Israel, the people of Israel, the leaders, the religious people of Israel, they were arguing with him all the time. They didn't accept him. They didn't like him. They ended up crucifying him on the cross because they did not accept, understand, and submit themselves to authority. And you know what Jesus said? He looked at that Roman military officer and he said these words, I've not seen faith like this in all of Israel. This is the greatest faith I've ever seen. This guy knows it. This guy understands what it means to accept authority. As American believers, we the people, we are under both civic and church authority. We have church leadership, we have civic leadership. And it's incumbent upon us to understand, accept, respect, and subject ourselves to civic and church authority. And when we do that, it positively impacts our behavior. It puts us in a humility state, and we say, I get it, Lord. We begin to understand. So the very first thing that he reminds us here is that we're reminded to be submissive, have a submissive attitude. The second thing, we're reminded to be strategic. The second part of the verse says, to obey, to be ready for every good work. Now, this idea of being ready, this is where we think, okay, I'm ready. That's not what it means. Okay, I'm ready. Go for it. No. It means to be prepared, intentional, organized, focused, and strategic. That means plan. It carries the idea of excitement and energy. The word works there is ergo, where we get a word energy. Prepared with energy. Enthusiasm about serving and working in ministry. That's what he's talking about here. So back to verse 1 and verse 6. What Paul says here is he's talking about some of the problems that they were having there in the churches, and he says, talking about the problem makers, and he says they profess to know God in their works, but deny Him, being abominable, disobedient, and disqualified for every good work. So disobedience disqualifies us for every good work, where obedience makes us ready, strategically ready for good works. Let me put a commercial in right here if it's okay. All right? Next Sunday night at 5 o'clock, we're having Awana in here, we are going to have a strategic church meeting. We erroneously call these business meetings. It's not a business meeting. It's like a let's go get 'em meeting, okay? We've got Easter and Mother's Day and Father's Day and every other kind of thing coming up here in the spring, and we've got to be strategic. We've got to be, are you ready for this? Ready to do it. And so I'm going to invite all of you to be here so that we can look forward to what we're need to be doing as a church in the next few months. So we need to understand, as we begin to visualize ministry opportunities and preparing ourselves to undergo training and strategically get all in to serve, work in ministry, what happens, and I've found this throughout life, what happens when we're going all in on ministry, our behavioral disorders begin to dissipate. We don't have the energy for it over here because we're putting the energy in over here. And that's what we do to get ready. He reminds us to be strategic. He reminds us to be submissive. He reminds us to be strategic. Then he reminds us on how to speak. To speak evil of no one, be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. Now, folks, this is the third time that Paul will use, or that the translators will use the word speak in Titus. However, this time, rather than using the word laleo to speak, he will use the word blasphemo. Look it up. To speak evil. Blasphemo. I've heard that word before. Blasphemo means to slander, revile, defame, speak irreverently, impiously, disrespectfully about anyone. Any kind of speech that is defamatory or abusive. And I put that in your footnotes there in your handout. Here's the truth. Because of our sin nature, by the way, do you realize that when we get saved that we still have a sin nature? We still sin. I wish we didn't, and one of these days, but one of these days, but we still have a sin nature. So because that we have a sin nature, if we're not repeating, if we're not restoring, if we're not remembering, what happens is that we begin to fade into our sin nature, and before we know it, we have moved into the sin of blasphemy. We start talking in the wrong direction. So we're reminded, don't blaspheme. How do I do that? Speak peaceably, gentle, humbly in speech rather than blasphemos. How do we do this? Remember to be submissive. Remember to be strategic. Remember how to speak. And it guides our behavior. Guidelines. Tell you something that happened to me a few years ago. I got a friend over there in Spring, over at Champion Forest. He's a pastor. He's been here for about 40 years in the Houston area. Done a great job. His name is John Gross. From time to time, he's come and worked here at our church. We partnered on a lot of stuff. And John had a guy in his church that he has the contract for the city of Houston on all of the construction blockades, all the flashing lights and all the things that you put up when you're working on a road. And so he has these tickets to the Astros. He has these tickets to the Rockets game, and the tickets to the Rocket games are really good tickets. And so John, and of course it was for his customers, so they had to be really good seats because, customers, city of Houston. And so every once in a while, a customer would cancel and would only get 2 or 3 hours notice, maybe a day's notice. And John would call me and he'd say, "Hey man, I've got tickets to the Rockets. You in?" And I said, "I'm in." And man, I'd get ready real quick and I'd make a silly excuse to Gala, and I'd just race over to his house and jump in his car and we'd go to the Rockets game. And the seats were really good. And I noticed as we'd go to these games that the people around the seat they were the same people, especially the guy in front of us. And he was really a good fan. I mean, he was loyal. And I got to kind of notice that they were all the same. I'm the only one that's different, each time. And so one day he calls me up during the playoffs. And he says, "I've got tickets." And I said, "Oh, good, let's go." And so we went. We got there a little early, and I mean the atmosphere was ecstatic. Everybody was excited, and everybody's dressed up in their stuff, And there's this one fan that was set in front of me every time, and we had been casual and nice and everything to me, and he come walking in, and he had a Ronald McDonald's wig on, the red wig, really big. And he had half of his face white and half of his face was red, the Rockets colors. He had a jersey on. He had one of those foam rubber hands that had the finger sticking up, that's about this big, and all. And, man, he come walking up. He had a beer in his hand, he come walking up and he sat down. He was so happy to be at the game. Well, I was happy for him too, And so the game started so we're ready for the game to start. The lights go out. The announcer come on. "Ladies and gentlemen." You know how they go. Yeah. And he's doing all the announcing stuff. And then all of a sudden, fireworks are going off. And then that big thing up there, that's a scoreboard thing, all of a sudden had rockets, fire coming out of it like it was going to blast off. And it was rocket fire was coming out of it. The players began to come down on ropes from that place up there and getting on and I mean, wow. Then fireworks were going off and then the lights going all over the place. And I thought, whoa, man, look at all this. I mean, they were really hyping me up, That's hard to do. I'm a real calm person. And so, so anyway, I thought this was going to be good. And it was good. The game was good. The guy in front of me, Ronald McDonald, the fan, after about 5 beers, he was happy, very happy. He was telling everybody what just happened over here and what just happened over there, and running that hand back and forth and standing up, and and I'm sitting behind him. I'm a fan too. I love the Rockets. Akeem, I love them. And some of the others. I missed half the game. And finally, it got to real exciting, and then he just stood up, wouldn't sit down. Everybody else was sitting down, and he wouldn't sit down. And so I stood up, and I just tapped him on the shoulder. And I said, "Excuse me, could you please sit down for a moment?" Oh, man, that was the wrong thing to do. Ronald McDonald turned around to me, got that white and red face like 1 inch from my nose. And could I just say it like this? He blasphemed. It was excruciating. I mean, he screamed and and said things, and my flesh was doubling my fist up. Said, "No, you're a preacher. Let it back down. No, you're not. Yeah, you are. No, you're not. Yeah, you are." Man. And so I said, how much of this am I going to take? And he wouldn't stop. And my friend John Gross over here, he said like this, he was the one that looked like he's crying. I'm saying, I'm the one that's getting beat up over here, And finally, the guy just wouldn't stop. And everybody watching the game, this is a better game here. We're going to see a fight. That's what we're going to see. And finally, I looked over at the usher. The usher's kind of like, and I went like this. And the usher walked over and escorted him out of the game. I felt pretty bad. He was a fan. By the way, in blasphemy, he said, "You're not a fan. You didn't pay for these tickets. I paid $1,000 for my tickets. You just get free tickets. You're not a fan. These are fans. Who are you?" I mean, just kept on and on and on and on and on, And so I sat there, and I didn't enjoy the rest of the game. And I would look over, the chute comes up this way, and I would look over, and I'd see Ronald McDonald. He'd be sitting up there, kind of looking out of that little ramp over toward me, and I'd look away. I felt really bad. And the usher would look at him and look at me and look at him and look at me. And finally the usher came up and said, "Hey, look, he's really sorry. He's had one too many." I think he said two too many, maybe 3. And he said he wants to apologize to you. Would it be okay if he apologized and you let him have his seat back? And I said, "Sure." And he came back over and he said, "I'm sorry." And he sat down, and we got to see the rest of the game. He said, "Okay, well, it's pretty good, right?" I don't know. I haven't been back to a Rockets game since. If John were to call me today and say, "You want to go to a Rockets game?" I'm thinking, I don't know. I like the Rockets. Don't get me wrong. They're winning right now. I like it. But I get flashbacks of Ronald McDonald right here. It's abuse. I don't know about you, but we are about to go into the most exciting period of time this earth has ever known. Do you realize that? I believe we're about to have a revival. I believe the Lord's about to come. I believe that we're all in a test right now. I believe the game is going to get really, really exciting. And the last thing that I want is to be ejected from the game. How about you? We're more than a fan, guys. We're players. We're workers. Well, as we come down to the end of the gauge, I've been trying to cast this idea of renewal and reconciliation and restoration. I envision the healing of behavioral disorders among our folks and among people and among prodigal children. I envision a new awakening that could spread across the country, and I don't want to be disqualified for every good work. I want to be ready for every good work, and I know you do too. I want to obey. I want to be ready. I want to be ready for every good work. I want to be submissive, and I know you do too. So the question is, are you ready?
On behalf of Pastor Dan and the folks at Community, thank you for joining us today at Community on Demand. Feel free to share this link with others, and please know you are always welcome to be our guest during a live service any Sunday morning at our campus in The Woodlands, Texas. For more information, just click on the link, www.cbcwoodlands.org. I hope you will again join us at Community on Demand.